Okay guys, like I said in yesterday's video, there's a few historical events I went over. I went over how Alexander the Great went through the area known as Turkey, Afghanistan, and basically Persia in general, and he was eventually replaced by the Sukhalids, as well as 3 other dynasties, which included the Macedonian Empire, which eventually fell apart and was eventually conquered by Rome. Then eventually, long after that, Islam took over the area. And when Mongolian invaders settled in the area and converted to Islam, eventually this would lead to the people in Afghanistan. And then after that, long after that, World War I came around, where the Ottoman Empire was eventually defeated, and the Middle East was supposed to be broken up into 3 kingdoms, ruled by the Husseins. And this family was eventually screwed over by Britain and France, who broke up the Middle East in not very intuitive ways. And this left the Kurds without a homeland, which has led to modern day problems all over the Middle East. But besides that, as time went on and Turkey reconquered their territory, and Azerbaijan and Armenia would fight against each other, not forgetting the Armenian genocide, don't forget, which Turkey still denies to this day, but guys like Cenk Uygur, who are from Turkey, but also are American citizens, have started to admit that they had caused, one of the worst killings of all time. Now, one of the people I didn't mention was Ataturk. Now, Ataturk believed in a specific type of government. You see, he was preceded by the Young Turks. And if you don't recognize that name, it is also the name of Cenk Uygur's organization, the Young Turks. And the Young Turks believed in a revolutionary type of government. Now, this type of government was based on the German style of governance. Now, I got some videos that I've watched on the subject, and it's been quite a while since I got all the details. But the basic point of this boils down to is that they wanted a central power, a strong central government that would revive the Ottoman Empire and cause it to regain all of its glory and have new territorial gains from Turkey to the Balkans, all the way conquering to India, being stronger than ever. And they failed miserably because they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the training, they didn't have basically the resources to accomplish any of that. So they failed miserably. Well, one of the officers at the time in Turkey was Ataturk. Now, his name was not Ataturk at the time. And after World War I happened and the remainder of the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Ataturk took control. And he was able to form a resistance group that kept Britain and France and Greece out of the country, overthrowing their governments there, because they really were overstretched at the time and they had lost so much power and influence and so much men, and they were just completely war weary at the time. So Ataturk was able to overthrow their rule. And by doing so, he was able to form a new government. And his government was formed around the model that France had based their government on. Now, the French government was all about internal reform. But besides that, it was also based around a very interesting idea. Now, in the United States, we have freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of speech. But instead of freedom of religion in France, the French have a different type of freedom. And that's freedom from religion. As in, religion will play no part whatsoever in controlling the government. The morality of religion would not influence the politics of the country. Now in France, that kind of makes sense. Not anymore, since France has now issues with a lot of Islamic groups in the area. But, excuse me, if I can turn that on. Nah, that's not gonna help me. Sorry, I'm trying to get some light in here because this area is just so dark you can't see anything. Anyways, they have a freedom from religion group in France. Yeah, I really need to turn on a light there. There, you can kind of see me now, right? That a little bit better? Okay, this is totally legal, by the way. Anyways, freedom from religion. Now, that doesn't really work in the Middle East. Especially since Ataturk forgot another important part of government, and that's a Supreme Court that cannot be subverted. See, every few decades, some politician or another would try to influence the government of Turkey in a way that is problematic. Basically trying to overthrow the government and install their own type of dictatorship, or leave the ideas of Ataturk. Now, the one loyal group of people inside of Turkey was always the military. In every few decades, the military would run a coup, oust the government, and march on to Ataturk's grave, and reestablish the Republic. In fact, the Republic of Turkey, not what it's called, but you can call it, it is a republic, were one of the first countries to give women the right to vote. In fact, they praised the United States when we eventually gave our women the right to vote. That's how early they got on board that. That should tell you a few things. But without having a strong judicial branch to make sure that the Constitution is always being followed, that meant the military always had to do a coup to ensure that people were doing what they were supposed to. That was up until recent times, where Erdogan was also being threatened with a coup. And since they were stupid enough to actually tell him they were going to run a coup, he ordered some members of the military to guard a bridge for him while he marched into Parliament, took over, made sure to take over the police, and arrest every single dissident member of the military to make sure that they couldn't reestablish Ataturk's government. Now, something I didn't mention is Ataturk. Ataturk changed his name to Ataturk, and it means something along the lines like the first Turk, or something along those lines. As in, like, just the first citizen, which is something from Roman times, where the emperor was just the first citizen. However, in his case, he actually meant it. Well, he was basically somewhat of a president for life. He did eventually give up power and held elections. And I think his own daughter was eventually elected as, like, prime minister, or something along the lines. Again, based on France's version of the Republic. Now, if we're talking about like a country like Turkey, in Turkey, not Turkey, sorry, Hungary. In Hungary, their president deals with all internal affairs, whereas the prime minister deals with all foreign affairs. Whereas in Turkey, I believe they only have a prime minister, and he deals with both Christ, I'm sorry, my English is absolutely terrible tonight, guys. I'm sorry this is going to be such a terrible video on Sunday. But both foreign and internal affairs, similar to the President of the United States. Now, as I'm saying, Turkey eventually formed a new government, but they still celebrate Ataturk, holding yearly, it's about like a minute, I think, or like 5 minutes in his honor, where everyone has to get out of their car and stand at attention in honor of Ataturk. Because the new president, Erdogan, knew that if he didn't do that he would have a revolt on his hands, since he basically saved Turkey from extinction. Now, you might think that's a little bit cultish or weird, but it's not anything the military in the United States doesn't do. Hell, the military in the United States, anytime, every day, they play colors on every major military base across the country. And if you are called outside during it, you have to stand at attention. A lot of people will actually run inside the building as soon as that happens, so they don't have to stand at attention. It's pretty funny, actually. I quite enjoy how everyone panics when like colors is about to go off. But that's besides the point. It goes off twice a day, by the way. So their Ataturk thing, I wouldn't call it a cult of personality. It's more like just respect for the man that basically saved their country from being completely controlled by the West for all eternity. Anyways, back to World War I. When the Young Turks absolutely failed in their drive to recreate the Ottoman Empire, they decided to blame a small group of people in Yemen, where they captured about like 1 million or 2 million of them and marched them in circle for a few days until every single one of them died. And this is something that the Turkish government, even under Ataturk, denied for decades and still are denying. And eventually they would take over Cyprus, because Cyprus had the poor taste of wanting to reform a singular government with Greece. Well, Turkey wasn't having any of that and decided to invade the country and take over half of Cyprus, because there was a minority group of Turkish people in the country that they wanted to make sure weren't being oppressed. And you can tell what I think about that just by my tone of voice, can't you? It was an excuse. And Turkey has been causing a lot of issues with Greece, basically threatening to go to war with them for quite a bit now. Let's just say that Turkey are not the good guys in the whole situation, despite being part of NATO. But we're going to ignore that for now, because there was one group of people they didn't like, and that was the Kurds. And they have been trying to wipe out the Kurds within Turkey, oppressing their minority, taking them out in Iraq, attacking them in Syria, kind of letting them go unmolested in Iran. But, just causing a whole bunch of issues all around. Until eventually, a bunch of the rebel groups inside Syria eventually took out the Syrian government. And now Trump is trying to formalize relationships with the new Syrian government and make sure that they're not as terror-y as they used to be. And trying to do it in a way without wiping out every single member of the government, like we did in Iraq, which already makes Trump a better leader than George W. Bush is. Now, I will grant you, again, that I don't feel bad for Saddam Hussein, but the government we replaced them with is barely any better. And, they're not our allies, they're not our friends, they're not anybody that we can ever rely on. And there are terrorist cells that form inside of Iraq, and they're too weak to do anything about it. Basically just making us persona non grata in the area, as best as anybody can ever ignore the United States. But that's basically what we are there. Just a bunch of pissants to them. And I guess I can't hardly blame them. But anyways, as I was talking about yesterday, eventually the Taliban were overthrown in Afghanistan by the United States. And Al-Qaeda was basically wiped off the face of the earth, only to be replaced by ISIS, which grew in prominence under Obama. And there were theories that ISIS could never be defeated because they were so harsh, so evil, such a horrible entity that you would have to be more monstrous than them to ever wipe them out. Now, one of the places that this ideology was being passed around was on a little show called Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman. Now, this show is one of my favorite shows of all time. In fact, I would like to buy the DVD set and just spend a few months just watching every single episode daily, just to get a good feel for it. On my old channel, I actually got a episode, or at least a few minutes of Through the Wormhole uploaded to my channel. Now it's privated, but it's unlisted, so anyone can look at it if I post a link. And despite that, it still got copyrighted, which is one of the reasons I eventually moved here. But it doesn't really matter, because I still got that clip. That clip is actually pretty good. But anyways, Through the Wormhole stated that you cannot take out ISIS unless you're more evil than them. And it just turns out that you just actually have to act on any intelligence you have and wipe out every single leader amongst them until they fracture into tiny little pieces. Thanks again, Trump. You did a hell of a job with that, and I actually mean that. Obama would bomb countless people, but he would never bomb the people that actually mattered. Except Osama bin Laden. I appreciate him taking him out. But there were plenty of opportunities to take him out, they just never took it. Until eventually they took him out. And that just meant that Al-Qaeda was eventually replaced by ISIS. And when the Taliban took back over Afghanistan under Biden, and the Taliban has now been fighting against ISIS-K, one of the three groups I'm talking about. There's ISIS, then they call themselves ISIL of the Levant, and then there's ISIS-K, a couple different factions of them. Now, I was talking about Ahmed, yesterday. Ahmed Mossad. And yes, it sounds like Mossad from Israel. Now, Ahmed, I called him like Mussolini yesterday, so apologies for that. But Ahmed was killed just before 9/11, and his son formed a government when Afghanistan eventually became a democracy under the United States. And Ahmed was one of the last people, as well as the vice president of Afghanistan, to fight for the country, as Biden just abandoned him to die. But Ahmed and the vice president managed to escape and make it to the nearby country of, I apologize, it's either Tajikistan or Turkmenistan. I cannot remember for the life of me. It's one of the two. So we now have a government in exile. And we still have people who are descended from the Mujahideen who still want a democratic government, including Ahmed Jr. And I hope that someday that we will eventually be able to form a new government there, one that the people of Afghanistan will actually accept, that doesn't oppress women and minorities and run under his Islamist government. Now, Islamist is kind of a interesting term because the Islamists of Turkey are very different from the Islamists of, say, Afghanistan or Iran or Pakistan. See, the Islamists in Turkey didn't want the freedom from government ideology that Ataturk related. They wanted to be able to freely express their religion and put some of their religious ideology into the government without it overtly controlling their democracy. Or their republic, I guess you could say. They're not much of a democracy anymore. They basically have a dictator at this point. Which means that, by all rights, Turkey should be thrown out of NATO and the EU. But let's just say it's very complicated, alright? And that's a whole story for another time. But basically, what I'm saying is all of this is related to each other. All this history comes together to form the modern day problems of the Middle East. Yeah, I may have gotten a few things wrong here or there, but this is the two-part history lesson of the Middle East that I wanted to make. That not all Islamist governments are necessarily evil, are necessarily supporting of terrorists. But that doesn't stop them from being, well, suppressing their own people, suppressing their own minorities, causing wars that don't need to happen, like the war in Cyprus, overthrowing governments, and all the other nonsense that happens there. But I think I'll leave it at that for now, guys. This must be a two-parter episode, and eventually I'll continue the history lesson as I go back over some of the details. I'll give a more extensive lesson on how all that worked out. So, for now, guys, talk to you later. Bye.